Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We're looking at Jesus' teaching in the Olivet Discourse, and specifically where he said, Matthew 24, verses 15 and following, "When you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, whoso reads, let him understand. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains." Get out of town. This section of the Olivet Discourse, needless to say, it is the source of so much paranoia, so much fear-mongering, so much teaching about what is just about to take place. And yet, when properly understood, we can realize that the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation was in the first century. That was its location, temporally speaking. It is stunning to me how Bible students can ignore the context of Matthew 24, essentially wave their hand and say, well, in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is not talking about the destruction of Jerusalem at all. He's actually talking about the end of the age. Well, he's talking about the end of the age. He is talking about the tribulation, but that was in the first century. One has to completely and totally ignore virtually every rule of exegesis, every rule of proper hermeneutic, in order to get the modern views of a futurist eschatology, and specifically dispensationalism, some forms of amillennialism, out of this text. Now, we've been looking over the last couple of videos at the abomination of desolation. I hope you will pay particular attention to the two videos that demonstrate that whatever the abomination of desolation was, it would be the sin of Israel, i.e. the abominable acts committed by Israel that would lead to her desolation. Throughout the Old Testament, as I've shared with you, God said that it was Israel's sin that would lead to her ultimate desolation. Deuteronomy 28-30, Leviticus chapter 26, it's in the book of Kings, it's in the book of Chronicles. It would be Torah violation that would bring God's judgment on her. Now, very quickly, let me just say this again. For those who believe, as I once did, that the law of Moses was done away at the cross, you have to be able to explain how it is that Torah violation would lead to that judgment, as Malachi chapter 3 emphatically teaches, especially when we conflate it with the ministry of John the Baptizer as the messenger predicting that coming judgment, the judgment that would come as a direct violation of Torah. You can't have a judgment for violating Torah unless Torah is in effect. Now, this is driven home, actually, by the fact of what Paul teaches about the man of sin, the spirit of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Now, it's interesting to me, as I've been sharing with you in Sam Frost's book, The Parousia of the Son of Man, of Sam Frost, absolutely unparalleled and unprecedented claims about what Paul teaches in 2 Thessalonians. But nonetheless, it is fascinating to me, and it's sad, it's truly sad, to see these incredibly wild and unsubstantiated claims being made by Mr. Frost, and how he completely ignores what the text says and then imposes things on the text that are simply not there. He makes the man of sin to be nothing but a generic concept of lawlessness. And he wants us to believe that didn't happen in the first century. he says Paul was refuting the idea that the apostasy had to take place before the day of the Lord and that the man of sin had to come before the day of the Lord. Well, okay, here we are. Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 said that the spirit of lawlessness, what is that spirit of lawlessness? Well, it would reject Jesus. It would be an overall spirit of ungodliness. I've already pointed out to you that, number one, Jesus predicted the apostasy. Matthew chapter 24, 10 through 12, the apostasy of the majority of people. Number two, guess what? He predicted the spirit of lawlessness. Because lawlessness will abound. What kind of lawlessness? The very kind of lawlessness that Paul's talking about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So Jesus himself most assuredly did predict the apostasy and the spirit of lawlessness, a spirit of lawlessness, a time of lawlessness that would be so great that the majority would fall away. Now, all of that had to do with first century Judaism, that first century spirit of ungodliness. And notice how Paul drives that home in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 4. When speaking about this, quote, man of sin, unquote, this spirit of lawlessness, he says, this man of sin, quote, opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshiped. Now watch this. So that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Now wait a minute. The spirit of lawlessness would be focused on the temple. He sits in the temple of God. Where would the resistance to the early church spring from? The temple at Jerusalem and the Sanhedrin. Now, you've got to catch the power of this. There is no temple of God today in Jerusalem where the spirit of lawlessness takes its seat or where the man of sin takes its seat. Paul is not talking about something so far removed into a time in which there would be no temple. Well, our dispensational friends say, oh, but wait, there will be a temple. Why not accept the fact that Paul's saying the spirit of lawlessness is already at work and is being restrained? And you know that when the restrainer is taken out of the way, that man of sin or that spirit of lawlessness will be revealed. Now look, folks, if the restrainer was already restrainer, then the man of sin and that spirit of lawlessness of which Paul is talking about was already present. Now, I've just got to take note of the fact, I'm not going to spend a separate video on this, but Mr. Frost actually takes the position, quote, it is entirely unsure as to whether or not this section, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, even represents his, that is Paul's, personal eschatological view. Can you believe that? His reason for that? Well, because Paul nowhere else talks about this, quote, spirit of lawlessness, i.e. the man of sin. Well, yes, he does. He talks about the apostasy in 2 Timothy chapter 3. He talks about that spirit of lawlessness. No, he doesn't use this spirit of lawlessness specific term, but in 2 Timothy chapter 4. When you look at Paul's teaching, he talks about these very things. Thus, for Mr. Frost to suggest that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and his discussion of the apostasy and the man of sin is not even his personal theology, that is literally stunning. It is unbelievable. Back to the point, this spirit of lawlessness had to do with the temple. Just like Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 24 about that coming apostasy, about that coming spirit of lawlessness that would dominate that generation, Paul is talking about those very things, and he says that spirit of lawlessness, that man of sin, would be focused and would sit in the temple of God. Now look, I used to believe that that was talking about the church, and that the man of sin was the Roman Catholic Pope. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. When Paul said the spirit of lawlessness is already at work, I'm sorry, the Roman Catholic Church was not already present. It was not already at work. It just doesn't work. That's not to excuse the historical sins, errors, and grievous errors of the Roman Catholic Church. It is simply to point out that that interpretation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is untenable. So, when we talk about the abomination of desolation, when we conflate it with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, or when we look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we conflate that with Jesus' teaching in Matthew 24, in order to accept Mr. Frost's views, you have to divorce 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 from Jesus' teaching. I've already shown you that can't be true. Jesus predicted the apostasy. He predicted the spirit of lawlessness, and he said it would be in that generation. That means it would be in the generation when the temple was still standing and the man of sin would sit in the temple of God. You know, this is incredibly powerful stuff. It ought to give us tremendous hope, comfort, and assurance of the future. We're not looking for, we do not have to fear a yet future great apostasy, a yet future man of sin, and a yet future coming of the Lord. You know why? Because Paul said that this man of sin, this spirit of lawlessness, which sat in the temple, would be destroyed at the coming of the Lord. Well, you know what? That means the temple had to stand, had to be standing at the time of the coming of the Lord. Temple's not standing, the coming of the Lord, in the manifestation of His glory, has taken place. Hey, thanks for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. And of course, we've got more. I'll see you on the flip side.